A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and today I'm going to talk to you about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and in particular talk to you about accident investigation. Now, I'm sure we're all aware that a huge portion of the Earth's surface is covered with water, so it's around 71% of the Earth's surface, and of course the sea carries 90% of world trade around, and therefore at any one time there's something in the region of about 30 million people working at sea. Obviously this isn't just on deep sea ships, this is on anything designed to traverse water. 2025 effectively marks the 43rd anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Commonly known as UNCLOS, or sometimes as the Constitution of the Oceans, UNCLOS is one of the most widely ratified treaties. It has 168 signatories, which of course include the United Kingdom and the European Union, and most of the developed world. Before the development of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, the oceans were largely governed by very, very old freedom of the seas legislation, which comes pretty much from the 17th century onwards. Coastal states would have rights over a narrow band of territorial sea adjacent to their land, roughly equivalent to the distance at which a cannonball could be fired from the shore, hence the original territorial sea limit of 3 nautical miles. However, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea did change this and extended the jurisdiction of states to 12 nautical miles for the territorial sea. Negotiations for the development of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea began in 1950, and in 1956 the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea began in Geneva. It took all the way until 1982 for a third conference to conclude and result in the new treaty, UNCLOS as we know it in the modern day, that replaced previous 4 conventions that were started in 1956. So essentially, our current version of UNCLOS was born in 1982. UNCLOS was a framework convention, and what this means is that it set out broad commitments and principles for the various signatories, but leaves the setting of some of the specific commitments to national legislation. This is why it's often referred to as the Constitution of the Oceans. Now, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has lots of different articles within it, but the articles that really apply to us are the maritime zones and boundaries and, of course, the high seas. Maritime zones and boundaries, which were defined by UNCLOS, extended that 3-mile cannonball range up to 12 nautical miles. 12 nautical miles is the territorial sea of a state, and within those 12 nautical miles, the state has the right to implement its national legislation. Now, from 12 to 24 miles, we have something called the contiguous zone. This is a very, very technical zone that allows the state to pursue ships and persons who have committed an offence within the territorial sea, to pursue them up to 24 miles. Now, the contiguous zone has a very, very unique nickname given to it when ships and persons are pursued beyond the territorial sea into the contiguous zone, and UNCLOS calls this the right of hot pursuit. UNCLOS also defines something called the exclusive economic zone. The exclusive economic zone is even today subject to debate, as it extends 200 miles from the baseline of the coastal state, and basically any minerals and deposits that are found under the ocean within that 200 nautical miles remain the property of the adjacent coastal states. Of course, it's obvious to see that 200 nautical miles sometimes includes other people's exclusive economic zone, and therefore this does tend to drive somewhat of a debate amongst those countries as to who has the rights over the minerals and deposits within the sea. UNCLOS has lots of different sections to it, different articles that apply, but there is an article that basically talks about the duties of a flag state. Now, a flag state is fundamentally the state that is responsible for a ship that has registered with it and that flies its flag. And the primary obligation of a flag state is to make and enforce legislation upon that ship so that that ship complies with somebody's laws. In other words, it's not a lawless vessel with no flag. I did do a podcast on the Dark Fleet, and Dark Fleet ships are exactly that. They do not have a bona fide flag state and therefore claim to not be legislated by any particular state. But it's the duties within the flag state under Section 7 that I'd like to discuss here in this podcast, and that is that it says that each state shall cause an inquiry to be held by or before a suitably qualified person or persons into every marine casualty or incident of navigation on the high seas involving a ship flying its flag and causing loss of life or serious injury to nationals of another state, or serious damage to ships or installations of another state or to the marine environment. So in other words, under Article 94 of UNCLOS, it requires flag states to investigate accidents on ships that happen on its own flag vessels and happen on other flag vessels within its territorial waters. Now, the United Kingdom has done this by establishing an organisation known as the Marine Accident Investigation Branch. The Marine Accidents Investigation Branch are a government department that fundamentally meet the requirements of Article 94, Paragraph 7 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The Marine Accident Investigation Branch receives somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 reports of all types of accidents every year, and on average it leads to around 30 separate investigations being launched into the reports of those accidents. Obviously the reports of the accidents vary very, very much in how serious they were, but 30 separate investigations being launched indicates a significant number of reports being produced. The MAIB are essentially an independent unit within the Department for Transport, and they have 4 accident investigation teams which are supported by an administrative team, and of course they're based right here in Southampton. They've got around 35 members of staff. The MAIB are empowered under multiple bits of legislation. The MAIB's power to board a ship for the purposes of investigation is given by the United Kingdom's Merchant Shipping Act, Section 259, the powers to inspect ships. But the actual regulations that surround the investigation of accidents, as required by UNCLOS, are the Merchant Shipping Accident and Investigation Regulations, which came out in 2018 after the United Kingdom had exited the EU. Now, the reason that we had to update this legislation is that compliance with EU regs prior to the United Kingdom's exit met the requirements of UNCLOS. However, having left the EU, we needed additional legislation to bring the laws back under purely United Kingdom national legislation. The MAIB is responsible for carrying out an investigation to determine the cause of an accident. It's responsible for publishing reports. It increases awareness of how maritime accidents happen, and it improves, of course, national and international cooperation in maritime accident investigations. The MAIB is what we call a mature organisation. In other words, their priorities are very, very different to that of an enforcement agency like the MCA. The priorities of the MAIB are to investigate the accident and help to determine the cause of the accident with a view to preventing that accident from happening again. The MAIB are not an enforcement agency, and therefore, during their investigation, if they discover any facts, the MAIB will never use those facts to try and prosecute. Prosecution under any flag state is the responsibility of the flag state administration. Therefore, within the United Kingdom, the flag state administration is, of course, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, the MCA. Now, the MAIB regularly produce reports, and the reports are very, very much worth reading. The reports are split into two different types fundamentally. Quarterly, the MAIB produce a series of reports. These are lots of small reports into less serious accidents that are put together in what they call a safety digest. The safety digest is broken up into merchant ships, fishing vessels and leisure craft, and those three sections contain smaller reports about some of the investigations that they have undertaken. However, for the most serious marine casualties, the MAIB will, of course, undertake a full investigation, and that full investigation will result in a very extensive report being made. Now, the MAIB actually has a marine guidance note out in order to determine what it considers to be a marine casualty. And under this marine guidance note, a marine casualty is the death or serious injury to a person. And when we talk about serious injury, we talk about an injury that keeps that person off of work for 3 days, or an injury which hospitalizes a person for more than 24 hours. It includes the loss of a person from a ship, the loss, presumed loss, or abandonment of a ship, serious material damage to the ship being unfit to proceed or requires flag state approval or a condition of class before it may proceed after an incident. At sea, the breakdown of a ship that requires towage, the stranding or disabling of a ship, or the involvement of a ship in a collision, and material damage to marine infrastructure external of a ship that could seriously endanger the safety of the ship, another ship, or any individual. Now, pollution is also covered by MAIB investigations, but this is pollution that is caused by damage to a ship. So the MAIB, for instance, will not investigate accidental discharge of, let's say, oil from a ship, but it will investigate an accident that led to the discharge of oil from a ship if, for instance, the hull had become damaged. As well as issuing reports, the Marine Accident Investigation Branch will also issue safety bulletins. Now, safety bulletins tend to come out very, very quickly after the incident itself. A safety bulletin is basically a summary of some of the findings that are discovered initially at the start of an investigation. Now, it might be at the start of an investigation of an MAIB investigation. It may be at the start of an investigation by another flag state who have decided to share their initial findings with everybody else. A great example of this is an MAIB safety bulletin which was published just a few weeks ago in February 2025, and it's about something that we discussed in an earlier podcast, and that is the Egyptian liveaboard dive boats that are operating in the Red Sea. You may have listened to my podcast where I talked about a ship called the Sea Story, which very, very sadly capsized. Now, this was a ship that had been fundamentally changed. It had had an extra deck added to it, its stability wasn't great, and the safety management system used to run the vessel was not entirely whole. Now, these dangers have been identified by the MAIB, and they do form the basis of a safety bulletin. As I say, it literally came out just a few weeks ago. It would be unfair for me to continue to talk about the MAIB as if they were the only investigation body within the world. The Americans have got their hands full at the moment. They are, of course, investigating quite a few incidences that have happened over there, and some of them, of course, are very, very high profile. For instance, you may remember that the container ship Dali collided with the Francis Scott Key Bridge and caused it to collapse back in March 2024. Now, this was a very, very high-profile incident. It was a very dramatic incident because it brought down a huge bridge, and of course, very sadly, led to some loss of life. The loss of life was actually on the bridge itself, and although a seafarer was injured on the front of the ship, nobody on the ship actually perished. Those people who very sadly died were actually workers that were working on the bridge at the time it was hit. Now, just like the MAIB, the NTSB have already produced a preliminary report on the contact of the container ship Dali with this bridge, and it can be easily found by going onto the NTSB website and searching for it. Whenever an accident happens, obviously there is a lot of media speculation, and to meet a lot of this media speculation, it is usual for investigative bodies to make preliminary reports in order to present the facts to people so that we do not have runaway misinformation happening by speculation within the media. And that's exactly what the NTSB did on May the 14th, 2024, by publishing their preliminary report into that tragic accident. Another really good example of a marine investigative body that has made some absolutely excellent reports are the Germans. Now, the German investigative body was responsible for investigating the very, very sad death of several people on board a ship called the Suntis. Now, this shows an excellent example of cooperation between flag states. The Suntis was a German flagged vessel, but she was moored in a UK port. She was moored in Immingham in the UK. There was a very unfortunate accident where some people went down into the forward hold to smoke a cigarette and found themselves in a dangerous atmosphere and were overcome by a distinct lack of oxygen. 2 people collapsed and 2 people went in to try and rescue them. And of course, if you enter an enclosed space without wearing breathing apparatus to try and rescue somebody you've seen collapse, there's a very, very good chance that you may succumb to whatever it is that the initial casualty has been overcome by. The Federal Bureau of Maritime Casualty Investigation, as they are called in Germany, they were the ones who led the investigation into the deaths on board the Suntis. So although Suntis fell under the MAIB's jurisdiction because this happened within the United Kingdom territorial waters, as of course defined by UNCLOS, the Germans asked if they could lead the investigation and the MAIB agreed. The German report on the deaths that were suffered on the Suntis goes into some incredible detail, including pictures of the cigarettes that had been dropped by the persons that went down into the hold to smoke them when they were subsequently overcome by the lack of oxygen. It was an excellent report written by the Germans and translated into English. Again, you can find it very, very easily on the internet by searching for the Suntus report and going to the German website. It is called something which I will attempt to pronounce now, but whether I'll be able to or not, it's actually called the Bundesstelle for Sinn- und Funterschlung, which translated means the Federal Bureau of Maritime Casualty Investigation. I'm sure somebody that's a fluent German speaker will have heard that and said, "Nice try, Barry, but you're not quite there with your German pronunciation." But nonetheless, that's what you're looking out for on the internet when you Google Suntis accident report. It will come up with the first word as the Bundesstelle. So that is the Federal Bureau. So you'll be able to tell whether you're heading in the right direction for searching that report. MAIB reports are an essential part of UK maritime life. They take very, very experienced people, they put them into an investigation, and these people are able to carefully analyse what has happened. Using evidence and very modern and detailed investigative techniques, they are able to produce reports which don't just explain what happened, but educate those of us that work at sea in how we may do things better in the future. Some of you may have listened to my podcast on one of the latest reports to be issued by the MAIB, and that is on the fatality of a chief engineer whilst working in an enclosed space on a super yacht. That report published by the MAIB is very, very detailed, and it highlights numerous failings within the safety management system on board the ship that led to the chief engineer being able to access what was essentially a confined space without a permit to work, without telling the master, and without taking any precautions. The level of investigative excellence that is demonstrated throughout the world is very, very highly regarded. The Maersk Honum is another great example of a very, very in-depth investigative report done by the Singapore Maritime Authority. The Maersk Honum was a very large container ship that had a huge fire in its forward holds, and due to the dangerous cargo that it was carrying in those holds, the fire got out of control very, very quickly, and very sadly some of the crew members died. Now, some of the facts that come out in that Singapore report, again, very, very detailed. And when an investigative body assigned by a state starts its investigation, it will share information and it will approach other investigative bodies with a view to getting their view and tapping on their experience by talking to them and asking them for help with their own investigation. This very, very much happens when a Red Ensign Group ship has an incident and a Red Ensign Group state has to investigate. They will often draw on the expertise of the MAIB to help them with their investigation and help them ascertain exactly what has happened in the particular incident that they are investigating. Maritime investigations are an incredibly important way of improving maritime safety. You should never be afraid to cooperate with a maritime investigation. The body that is investigating the incident are not there to prosecute you. They are there for reasons of safety, and this is particularly the case with the United Kingdom's Marine Accident Investigation Branch. Prosecutions are undertaken by the MCA. The investigation, purely for safety and purely for the prevention of a reoccurrence of the incident, is done by the MAIB. Cooperating with an investigation by the MAIB is enshrined into United Kingdom law. but a seafarer that's being interviewed by an MAIB inspector should never be afraid to say what has happened. Whatever they say will never be used against them, and the more detail that can be provided by witnesses to an accident, the better the chance of the MAIB getting to the bottom of what happened and being able to produce a report that prevents future incidents from occurring. Always engage with investigative bodies. They're there for yours and the safety of other seafarers and passengers alike. Thank you very much for listening to our podcast. It was a pleasure having you on board, and I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. Have a great day, everyone.